Hi. Thanks for the intro. How about a round of applause for these organizers and relaunching this meetup? So today I'll be presenting my talk, Taking Flight with Urkel. It's for the most part going to be a fairly broad overview of all things Urkel, GraphQL, clients. But quick intro about me. I'm a software engineer at Formidable. Formidable is a JavaScript consultancy specializing in React, GraphQL, and Node. We're also an open source software organization. And I actually recently moved to Denver to join Formidable. And in an attempt to assimilate to Coloradoan culture, I climbed my first 14er with my coworker Kylie Stewart and some other folks here in the audience. And it was really painful, but it was super worth it. And Kylie, aside from being an avid climber, is also heavily involved in the GraphQL community. And earlier this month, she put out a poll on Twitter asking what people would like to see out of a talk like this. So it turns out a lot of people haven't heard of Urkel. So I'd just like to do a quick poll, show of hands here, who's heard of Urkel? Okay, it's pretty good. So there's a few of you. So awesome. So this talk will hopefully be relevant to a lot of you. So yeah, let's go ahead and answer that question. What is Urkel? First and foremost, it's an acronym. It stands for Universal React Query Library. That by itself doesn't really tell us that much, except that maybe it's specialized for React, which is true. But at its essence, Urkel is a developer tool distributed on NPM that enables developers to use GraphQL on the front end. It's a lightweight open source GraphQL client, and it's created and maintained by Formidable. So the talk that we just saw kind of gave us the groundwork for understanding what GraphQL is and how it compares with REST. This talk will hopefully shed some light on how we can actually use GraphQL, at least in the setting of React. So I do have some slides on context around GraphQL. I'm going to gloss over most of them because I think we had an amazing talk on what the differences are. So basically, it's a protocol for declarative data fetching. What this means is you ask for exactly the pieces of data that you want from a server, and the server will respond with only those pieces of data. It's an alternative to REST. It's efficient and easy to use. We love GraphQL. This is what a GraphQL query might look like. So we were asking for a user with the ID 1, asking for some fields off of this. And our hypothetical server could respond with some data. And it will respond with only what we ask for, nothing more and nothing less. So how do we actually use GraphQL on the front end? Well, one option that we have is to use a GraphQL client. So a client is a tool that enables some nice features that allow us to build powerful stuff on the front end. So they usually do things like provide an abstraction over the networking layer. So the easiest way to use GraphQL is to simply make a fetch request where you pass in the GraphQL endpoints and whatever options you want to pass along. So in the case of GraphQL, you would pass along like the query string and any variables in your query in this fetch call. So clients will wrap that for you. They usually provide something, they provide like some level of caching for you, and they provide integrations into your view layer. So what that means is if you're using a client, the client itself has logic bundled into it that will handle sending requests and it'll handle caching. But how do we actually get that data into our like UI components if we're using React or Vue or Angular? So a client such as Apollo will usually provide that as a separate package that will allow you to get the data into your UI. So then that begs the question, why Urkel specifically? So these are some of the things that we believe to be true about Urkel. It's simple to set up and use. It's customizable. It has a small bundle size weighing in at 6.5 kilobytes. And most importantly, it lowers the barrier to entry to GraphQL on the front end. This point is was the motivating factor behind the creation of Urkel, was to just simplify getting up and running with a GraphQL client on the front end. Some of the features that Urkel has that kind of point back to the why you would use it. So we expose the data that you would get from a server via React hooks, and also render props API. So if you're unfamiliar with React, React hooks is a recent addition to the framework that make writing our components a lot simpler, easier. So if writing the components with hooks is a lot simpler, and then Urkel supports hooks, that just makes using Urkel that much more simpler. Urkel has a simple default cache, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And one of the most powerful things about Urkel today is the concept of exchanges. And an exchange is a term that we made up, but I will talk a little bit more about what that looks like. But basically, the exchanges are what allow Urkel to be super flexible. And yeah, just reiterating, compact bundle size. So that was a lot. And let's take a quick break while we stare at this GIF of a cat. Okay, so if you've used GraphQL at all on the front end, you've probably heard of Apollo. It's kind of the elephant in the room, and for good reason. Apollo is really awesome. They provide tons of tools for using GraphQL on the back end as well as on the front end across a variety of different stacks. And they've done so much for the GraphQL community. Now, so it's reasonable to kind of call Apollo the status quo of GraphQL clients on the front end. So the origin story of GraphQL, which I'm going to spend a little bit of time going over, kind of goes into so Ken Wheeler, who used to work at Formidable, just gonna name drop that. He saw Apollo clients and all these packages you have to download, and I'll get into that. But basically, he sought to challenge the status quo, and he wanted to make something that was super simple to just get up and running and just get working with GraphQL on the front end. So if you were using Apollo during the time that Urkel came out, so this was around January of last year, you may have seen something like this in your package JSON, where you have 4 dependencies that are related to the Apollo client itself, and then you had another extra dependency to integrate that client into whichever view, whatever stack you're using. So in this case, I was using a React app, so I have the React Apollo package, and then all these other packages I had and I needed to download and set up in order to get a minimal functioning Apollo client working in my app. And there was no way around this at the time. You needed to download all of these. And so Ken Wheeler came in and said, nah, we're going to do this. So Urkel is one package, and everything that you need, the clients as well as the integrations into React, are all packaged together into Urkel. So not going to spend a ton of time on this code, but basically this is a sample client setup if you wanted to use Apollo. So you have these links, and you initialize the links with like your URL of the GraphQL endpoint that you're going to hit. And then if you want to do authentication with like JWT, you use the set context function, which takes in a request that has like the headers that it's going to send. And then you can pull out those headers because you don't want to overwrite the headers. And then you can get the token and then put the token on the headers, and then you create the client on there. So we also sought out to make that process a little bit smoother. So there's a helper method that comes out of Urkel called a create client, which simply wraps the new client constructor, and it takes in a single object, and that object, with that object, you can configure all the properties that we want to pass to the client. So we can pass in the URL. We can pass in a property called fetch options, which takes either an object or a function that returns an object, and this object will be passed down to the underlying fetch call. So this is how we can do authentication. Yeah, so it's a little bit simpler. Now, so in summary of all of that, the goal of Urkel was, again, to provide a simpler method of getting started with GraphQL on the front end, right? But caveat here, Apollo has made some really awesome improvements to their work. So they recently, they released a relatively new package that wraps those 4 like Apollo, like the core Apollo library packages. This package is called Apollo Boost. So you can now download this one package, and then you'll get everything you need for the Apollo client. But you still need to download a second package to actually integrate the client into whatever view, into whatever front-end stack you're using. So yeah, what does Urkel look like today, and how do you use it? So we've maintained Urkel's small bundle size. Urkel by itself weighs in at 6.5 kilobytes. And as I mentioned, by itself, it has everything you need to get started with GraphQL on the front end. With just Urkel, you can download, you can send GraphQL queries, you can send mutations, you can do subscriptions, you can do authentication, anything you would need from like a reasonable small to mid-level application you can do with base Urkel. Now, we also recently released an add-on package to Urkel called GraphCache. And GraphCache is one of these exchanges that I mentioned earlier. So without getting too deep into it, GraphCache is a normalized exchange implementation that you can add onto Urkel. And basically what that is like a more robust cache. It does some more fancy stuff for you so that you can build out some more powerful features without having to do them manually. And as you can see, like it does some pretty heavy stuff for you. I mean, GraphCache itself is larger than the entire Urkel library. So Urkel and GraphCache together are 14.5 kilobytes. And then Status Quo, Apollo Boost, and Apollo React hooks, which together make up the minimal set of dependencies required to get Apollo working in your React app, weighs in at 30 kilobytes. So yeah, we have React hooks in Urkel. This is how you query for data. So Urkel exposes a hook called useQuery. And if you're unfamiliar, a React hook is simply a function that you can store some state in the function, you can perform some side effects, you can do whatever you want in the function, and you can return some values out of it. So what we're doing with this useQuery hook is we pass it in the query that we want to send to the backend, and then we can read the response from it. So this response value is an object. It's commented out down below. So it'll always have these 3 properties. It has a fetching and error state. So those tell us whether or not the query is still loading or if we've encountered an error. And then if those are both false, then we'll have our data, presumably. Yeah, so this next bit is all about Urkel's exchanges and about a feature of Urkel that I like to call its programmable core. And we'll see why in a minute. So this diagram depicts one single exchange. And you can imagine that these two arches make up one exchange, and you have these conveyor belts that kind of go through each arch. And on the one end, we have operations that flow through, and these are GraphQL operations. So we can imagine like little boxes that will flow through this arch, and that box contains GraphQL operation data, so like the query and the variables, and maybe some other metadata. So this box will flow through the exchange, and the exchange can do whatever it wants with the box. It can read the data, it can write some other data to it, or it can take some data and store it somewhere. It can do whatever it wants. We don't care. And then it will send the box along its way on this conveyor belt. So, so the entry point would be like when you invoke a use query hook, for example. So when you're invoking any GraphQL operation, that operation, that box will flow through, and then once it hits the server and comes back, it'll flow back out, and it will be packaged up as an operation result. And then the exchange, which again is made up of the two arches together, can then operate on that stream of events. So this is pretty powerful because we can link these exchanges together, sort of like a chain or an operation pipeline, and basically feed a stream of events that will go through each exchange, and then as those events go out to a server and they come back, we can then feed those events back through the exchanges. And in fact, all of Urkel's core logic lives in a series of these exchanges. And so the exchanges they're modular and they're interchangeable, which means that you can bundle up, you can package up whatever related code, whatever logic you're trying to work on. So for example, a cache, you can bundle all of your caching code inside of one of these exchanges, and then you can link it, you can attach it to this link. And in this way, you're able to, one, you can write your own exchanges and attach it to Urkel's list of exchanges that it's going to use. And so if you have some use case that you need fulfilled, for example, if you need persisted queries, you can write an exchange. And in fact, somebody in the open source community did write an exchange for persisted queries. And so you can go and download that and then add that to your list of exchanges. And you can swap the exchanges out. Any exchange that you don't end up using will be tree shaked, so it doesn't end up in your final like client bundle. So yeah, exchanges kind of make up the majority of Urkel's core logic, and with them we're able to customize it to meet our needs. So this is a diagram of the default exchanges that Urkel comes bundled with. So we have a dedupe exchange, which will simply deduplicate in-flight requests. A cache exchange, which implements Urkel's simpler default cache. And I say simpler because it's simple, like relative to Apollo's default cache, which is a normalized cache. What Urkel does is more of like a document cache, so it'll just store the entire query response. It'll hash your queries, and then once you get a response back, it will store the entire response on that hash. And then it keeps track of which types you're asking for in your query. And that way, when you go and make a mutation that may affect one of these types, it can go look in its cache and see which queries are affected, and then invalidate those, and then resend those queries. And we'll actually see that in action in the demo. And then lastly, the fetch exchange. It wouldn't be a client if we didn't actually send out these requests. And as the diagram sort of depicts, we have this stream of events that kind of start over here on the left. And they start off as these GraphQL operations, and they'll flow through each of these exchanges one at a time. And then at the end, we'll get a response back from the API, and then it'll flow back through each exchange, and the exchange can do whatever it wants. So the cache exchange is a really good example here because it has a very different and important behavior. So when it sees a GraphQL operation, it'll check its store to see whether or not it has already seen this request. If it has, then it'll short circuit the network and just return that request. If it hasn't, it will pass the request along to the fetch exchange, which will actually execute the request. And then when the request comes back, the fetch exchange will hand that back to the cache exchange, and then the cache exchange will do what it does to store the results. Cool. So that's that's it for the talk portion. Now I'm going to get into a demo and kind of show you how to get started with Urkel in a React app. Okay, this is going to be kind of interesting. I'll just leave it on the chair. Any good demo has an awesome CRUD API for us to play with. And in this case, we're using an API that was that's built and maintained by Phil Pluktoon. He's an engineer at Formidable. He's one of the core maintainers of Urkel. And so if you haven't seen this interface before, this is GraphQL Playground, and it's super awesome. It's one of the really cool developer tools that GraphQL enables. Basically, as Sarah mentioned, the heart and soul of GraphQL is the schema. We wouldn't know what we can ask for from a server without understanding what the schema is. So GraphQL Playground gives us this little explorer view where we can see what queries and mutations and subscriptions we can do. The subscription is basically like a when you pull, instead of pulling for data, the server will push data to you. So we won't be messing with that in this demo though. So this API basically like a message board API. We're calling the messages threads. So we can query for threads. We can also query for like personalized user data. So we're going to take a look at some authentication in this demo. Oh yeah. Thank you. How's that? Cool. So yeah, this gives us a view of the schema. And over here in this pane on the left, we can write a query, and we can actually execute this, and the Playground will go and execute this query on your server. Cool. So we got some data back. Yeah. So we're going to be implementing this query and this mutation in our app. So this mutation is called like thread. It allows you to essentially upvote a thread. So yeah, we're just going to be implementing these two. And then the app that we're going to be building, creatively named Amazing App, doesn't have anything in it yet. But what we're going to do is render a list of threads or messages. And then for each of these messages, we're going to render a little heart icon that you can click to upvote it. And then we also have a sign in and sign up flow. So we when we go to set up the client, I'll explain how we can set it up so that authentication, so that we can authenticate users. Now, all of the views are already pre-built, so if you're not familiar with React, don't worry, because we're not going to be really writing any React-specific code, except for the hooks that we're going to be using. But all of the views and like logic has already been written. We are only going to concern ourselves with the with like how Urkel actually works. Is that good? Can everybody see that? Cool. So we're going to be working in 3 files today. We have an index file, threads.js, and a thread.js. So index.js is the main entry point of our React app. This is where we render our app to the DOM. Our threads component is what will actually render each of the threads. And a component in React is simply a function that can take in some properties and it'll return some UI. And inside of this component, we can use our useQuery hook from Urkel to fetch data from the server. And lastly, in our thread component, thread is also a component, and it takes in an ID. So it's the ID of the thread, a title, and the number of likes that the thread has. And then here is where we're going to write our mutation to like the thread. And yeah, that's what we're going to do. So first things first, we want to create our client. So as we saw in our slides earlier, we can use this create client helper, which we're importing from Urkel. And this is just a function that takes an object, and it has a couple of nice properties, one of which is the URL of the endpoint that we're going to hit. So we'll just copy that URL from our playground and paste that in there. And then one of the other properties that we can use is fetch options. And this one is super useful to handle authentication. So with fetch options, this property takes in an object or a function returning an object. So we'll do a function. In the case that you provide it a function, it will run this, Urkel will run this function before every request and then get the object that the function returns and then pass that object to the options to the fetch call. And fetch is just a built-in networking client. So, and one of the things that we'll want to do is pass in our authentication token as a header to the fetch call. So that way, if we have a token, we can send authenticated requests. So the first thing we'll do in here is pull the token from local storage. Whoops. And then once we have the token, we can define the object that, define the options that we will pass down to fetch, to the fetch method. So we want to pass it some headers, and we're going to give it this authorization header, which is a standard method of authentication and authorization on the web. So if we have a token, then we will give it the value bearer with the value of the token. Otherwise, we'll just give it an empty string because it won't matter. Cool. So yeah, what we just did was we created a client with Urkel's create client helper. We gave it the URL of the GraphQL endpoint that we're going to hit, and we specified a property called fetch options, which lets us handle authentication in our app. The second thing we'll need to do before we can actually write queries is wrap our app in Urkel's provider. So this takes a property called value, which wants the client that we instantiated. Cool. So what this does is it will expose our client to any instances of us calling like use query or any of the hooks that we end up using further down in our app. So with that in place, our auth flow should now work. And that's because I've already written the mutations to actually authenticate. I guess I can show you that really quick. So we have two mutations on this API. One is sign up, and the sign up mutation takes in, or it'll respond with a token. So we can ask for this token back when we sign up, and then we can store that in local storage. So if we sign up, and let's make a GraphQL Denver account. We'll just say the password is password. Network was not found. What? It wouldn't be a demo if it all went smoothly. Okay, so that time it worked. Not really sure what the issue was there. You can tell I haven't tested this with a long username, but essentially we have a personalized message. So we are sending a query for for the currently authenticated user. So if we look back at the playground, we have this me query, which we can ask for ID, username, avatar, created app. So I have this query already written in the app, and we're asking for username. So yeah, that's where that's coming from. And yeah, we also have a logout button. And if we look at our local storage, you can see that we have our token in here. So if we log out, the token disappears and the app refreshes because we're no longer authenticated and the message is gone. So cool. That's a sign up and sign in flow with Urkel. Well, of course, I mean, you have to implement the mutations, but if you're interested, I can show you that sometime later, or you can look at the code on GitHub later. So the next thing is to actually query and render all of the threads. So going into the threads components, first thing to do in here, now that we've already set up the client, is to use the use query hook and fetch our threads. So as we saw in the slides earlier, use query returns an array, and the array has two values. And the first value is the response object that comes back from the query. And this response object will actually change over time. So what'll happen is when you initially call this hook, when you call the use query hook, which is a function, it's going to return, like data immediately. Not actual data, but it's going to return response data, which includes fetching state and error state. So initially, since this is an asynchronous operation, the fetching will be true, and we'll need to handle that case. But as the GraphQL request is fulfilled and we get data back, the use query hook will update, and that will cause this component to re-render, which will give us a new value for response, and then we'll hopefully have actual data in the response. So use query is a function that takes an object that has a property called a query, and query is the GraphQL query string that we want to send. So we can go to the playground, we can copy that because we know it works. We can paste that in there. And then, yeah, that's it for writing a query. So we're invoking the use query function, and we're telling it what query it is we want to send to the backend. And then it'll respond with the data. So we have this response object, and I'm going to get rid of this stub. So in the case that the request is still loading, we show some loading UI. If there's an error, we show that there is an error. Otherwise, we render the threads from the query response. So response is an object that has a property called data, and that's just standard. So that will be this entire object. That's where the data key comes from. And then threads is what we're asking for in the query. So then we can map over those threads. For each thread, we'll render a thread and pass in all of the properties from that thread. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. Oh no, save. Yay. Yeah, thank you. Sweet. So yeah, we have threads, and we have some like messages, and then we have the buttons. Right now, the buttons aren't actually wired up to do anything, so you can click them and nothing will happen. So let's go ahead and implement those. So in our thread components, again, thread's a component, takes in some properties. In this case, it takes in properties related to a thread. So it takes in the ID and the title and the likes number, and we're rendering the title and then the number of likes next to each heart. So first thing we'll want to do is write the mutation using use mutation hook from Urkel. So similarly to useQuery, it's a function that we can invoke, but in this case, it doesn't take an object; it just takes in the mutation. And then it'll also receive an array with a couple values. Oh my gosh. And then the second value that comes out of use mutation as well as use query is a function that you can execute. And this function will invoke the mutation or the query again. So we can just name this whatever we want, and we'll name it like thread. So yeah, what we've done here is we now have this function called like thread that when we call it will execute this mutation. And then really quick, so the like thread mutation takes in one argument, and that's the thread ID. So that's important for the API to know which thread we're attempting to upvote. And we can get rid of this stub again. And we're already handling the error response. So yeah, since this mutation, you have to be authenticated to actually upvote a thread. It might be nice to alert the user to the fact that they're not authenticated, and if they want to upvote this, that they have to be. So we'll see what that looks like. And then the last thing to do in this file is to actually call the like thread mutation when some event occurs. In this case, we're looking at the button, and when we click the heart button, we want to send the like thread mutation. Right. So we have a handler written, and right now it doesn't do anything, but we can make it call like thread, and this is a function, and it takes in an object that maps to the variables that we want to send with this GraphQL operation. So we want to send in the thread ID, so we will define thread ID as a property, and we know the ID because it's coming in as a prop to this component, and that's it. So yeah, so to recap, what we've done is we've written our mutation in React, and we're pulling out the response object. So this response object will just be completely empty when this component initially loads. But once we call this like thread function, we will start to get data back in the response object. And when we call the like thread mutation, that will tell the clients to invoke this mutation. So if you go back to the app and we try to like something that we're currently not authenticated, so we get an error message. So let's go ahead and sign in. Oh God, I made the password, right? Oh, I did. Okay. So now we're signed in, and if we upvote a thread, it works. Yay. Yeah, GraphQL is cool. So yeah, that's that mutation in action. And then if we log out and then we try to upvote something, it doesn't work because we're not authenticated. And so one subtle yet powerful thing that's happening here is the like number goes up when I click that heart. How is the like number going up if I'm not actually doing anything to with the response of the mutation? So that's actually Urkel's default cache coming into play. So this threads query that we sent earlier on that retrieves the list of all of these threads. So we're sending this threads query, right? And when that goes through Urkel's cache exchange, Urkel attaches a special property called type name, which is available on any GraphQL type. And so it'll attach this property onto your query before sending it off. And then if at some later point in time, Urkel sees a mutation that operates on a type name that it has seen in one of the queries that it sent before, it will automatically invalidate that query and then refetch that data for you. So to see that in action, we can take a look at the network. Let's sign back in actually. So when I click one of these upvote hearts, we're actually going to see 3 queries go off. The first one is a query that Urkel sends when you're in develop mode. We can just skip that. It basically it's like an options query. I'm not exactly sure what it does. I think it might like fetch the schema or something. Anyway, it's not super important, and it goes away when you're actually built in for production. But the second GraphQL query that we'll see is the mutation get fired off. And then we'll see a third query, which will be the threads query firing off again. So it's very small. Nice. So this second GraphQL request that we sent off is the like thread mutation. You can see we get a response back. It has the thread that we've liked, the ID of the thread that we've liked. Then we do have this third request, and this is Urkel realizing that we've mutated data that it has seen in a previous query, so it will go ahead and refetch that data for you. So this is the second object, which is the second thread, title what is life, and the likes number is 2 because we've incremented that in our previous query or in the mutation. So yeah, that's it for the demo. Let me go back to the slides. This is a link to Urkel's homepage for documentation if you'd like to take a look at that and see how to get it going in your own app. And Urkel wouldn't be what it is today without so many amazing people and all of their hard work, especially Phil Plugtune and Yovi de Krook, who are formidable employees and Urkel's core maintainers, and a host of other people. So if you have questions about Urkel, feel free to reach them out on Twitter. I'm Ryan_Gilb on Twitter. So if you have questions about this talk or general Urkel questions, you can feel free to reach out to me. And then this is a nice link with a link to a GIS with a bunch of really awesome resources that I've compiled. Resources on learning about exchanges and like how to write your own exchange, and also a really awesome screencast that Phil and Yovi did with Jason Langsdorff, where they do a deep dive on getting Urkel not just set up, but like using the graph cache and implementing some really awesome features. So yeah, that's it. Thank you. Any questions? I saw your hand first.
Yeah. So if I wanted to subscribe to a GraphQL query and create a subscription, would I do that by placing the fetch exchange? Or does the fetch exchange support that?
That is a really good question. I believe the fetch exchange supports that by default.
Okay.
Could be wrong.
Okay.
But I believe that.
One other question too.
Yeah.
You don't mind. What TypeScript support is there? Do you guys have types on definitely typed?
Absolutely. Urkel is written in TypeScript, and in fact, the underlying data stream library that it uses for like observables is called Wonka, and that's actually written in Reason, and it's transpiled to JavaScript, and it has typings for TypeScript, so you can like use that wherever. But yes, Urkel, TypeScript, yes.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, John.
How do you implement optimistic updates, right? So like, can you short circuit?
Go look up that video with Jason Langsdorff. Nice. But yes, you can do optimistic updates with GraphCache, the normalized cache exchange.
Nice.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you mentioned that there were some open source contributors who created exchanges. Is there some sort of registry that you guys maintain for where those get stored?
Yeah, so we have a page. I've linked to that page in this gist. We have a page with all of the exchanges that are currently supported. So that persisted queries exchange is listed up on there, so you can go and view that. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So the hook had a on the response, it had a field error, and it looked like one of your slides was set to false. Is that accurate?
It may not be. It may be null or undefined and not false. Yeah, that's a good catch. So it'll either be like a GraphQL error or null or undefined.
So it's just forwarding the errors response from
the
functional GraphQL response.
Yes. So to be a little bit more specific, Urkel does do some like error combination. So it'll take the errors from the GraphQL request and any other like potential errors, for example, like a network error, and it'll combine those and then give those to you on that errors object, or in the errors property that comes out of the response object.
I'll ask one more. Is that GraphQL playground you're demoing? Is that generated? Like. Oh
yeah, this is oh gosh, I haven't like done this in a while. I believe it's a package, okay. And it comes like bundled in most like GraphQL backend implementations. So like Apollo. Yeah. So they support different servers. Yeah, it's super awesome. Thank you.
Brian.